I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
In our history, in the year 1934, Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in U.S. history at the time, had blown the whistle on what he called the business plot, where several large business owners who feared FDR's policies destroying their wealth had wished to establish a dictatorship instead. While the validity of his claim, that a business plot had existed at all, is contested to this day, Smedley had put his entire legacy on the line to prevent these alleged plotters from destroying American democracy. Smedley holds a very special place in our history, because regardless of the business plot's legitimacy, if it was true, his actions of exposing the plot would cement his place in history as a hero. But in this alternate timeline, Smedley has gone through with the plot. Shortly after FDR's inauguration, he became the Secretary of General Affairs, a super-constitutional dictatorial position, which gives him a blank check to preserve law, order, and democracy? What could have caused this stubborn adherent of democratic institutions to become a dictator? Why would a vocal critic of capitalism collaborate with its kingpins? How would this dictatorship even work? What happens to FDR's presidency? And how will the rest of the world react? Well, if you're watching this as a standalone, there's an entire series that you can watch that provides ample context to understand how this timeline has diverged so much from our history, and it's all been compiled into a movie format, with intros and outros removed for a more streamlined experience. I highly recommend you watch the German October movie. The link will be in the top right. But if you'd rather continue watching and learn more about this fashionable USA, stay tuned as we go into depth regarding exactly how this dictatorship would work. In our history, the United States of America had faced the Great Depression, which had destroyed the quality of life for countless American citizens. The Hoover presidency was disastrous for the crisis, as his insistence on refusing to use the federal government as a tool to combat employment had arguably elongated the suffering of many. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt had begun his campaign for presidency, he advocated for a New Deal, where the federal government would create several different institutions for the sole purpose of helping the economy recover. In order to fund these projects, as well as hopefully address the financial crisis, Roosevelt had vowed to end the gold standard, transferring the U.S. currency to a fiat one, allowing for the government to print money as needed to address the crisis. Upon news of this, allegedly, big on the allegedly, several large business owners had taken action to organize a coup against FDR. While the term fashionista had been thrown around quite a lot, it seems like the plotters had only cared for the effects of a fashionable regime on their ability to do business, rather than any sort of understanding of the ideology itself. I make this claim since out of all people to approach for the coup, for some reason, they picked Smedley Butler. While Smedley Butler certainly had the charisma to hypothetically lead a dictatorial nation, he had none of the motive or the ideology. Smedley was famous for his small books like War is a Racket, where he had self-confessed himself to be a racketeer for capitalism. According to Smedley, after he was approached by the plotter's intermediary, he had played along for as long as he could while gathering evidence and testimony. However, once he had officially blown the whistle, none of the suspected plotters would be called to the stand. Instead, only the intermediary had testified. And while there is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and may have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient,
during the committee, they had said, "The committee will not take cognizance of names brought into testimony which constitute mere hearsay."
While Smedley's actions may have brought him extreme ridicule, if he was telling the truth, he could have prevented the utter destruction of democracy in America. And it's for this reason that I commend Smedley for speaking out. While Smedley may not have gone through with this hypothetical plot, in this timeline he had. Why? Well, there are two major reasons behind my decision making. Due to the point of divergence, Smedley Butler had been directly fighting the Soviet Union. He would have been positioned in the Tianjin garrison, and would see him fighting Chinese and Russian communists by surprise. and since Tianjin fell, the Marines there would need to be evacuated, either continuing to support the fight against the Soviets, or be sent back home to recover. In order to adjust Smedley's mental state to the point of agreeing to perform a coup against a democratically elected official, I believe it would make sense for Smedley to return home after being injured. In our history, after Smedley had retired from the military, he had reflected on his actions as a US Marine and realized that he was a racketeer. I believe that in this timeline, while he may have had some sort of realization that he was advancing American business interests, he may not have come to the same conclusion as our history, seeing as communists had injured him and ended his decorated military career early. However, this alone isn't enough. Even if someone is shell-shocked, they are still themselves deep down, and Smedley was a hot-blooded American. He wished to vote, speak his mind, and guarantee those liberties for others.
My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write.
It was one of the reasons why he had become a soldier. He believed that by fighting for America, he was fighting for liberty. So what could have possibly forced his hand? Well, the only thing that could. Believing he was overthrowing dictators and guaranteeing the rights of his American kin. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this video so far. If you want to see more narrative-focused alternate history like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, and I would love to continue to make content for you all. Thank you for your consideration. Let's get back to the video. Imagine that you're Roosevelt. You had recently won a nearly 48-state sweep election, and as a result, communist paramilitaries had sprung across the entire nation, seeking to destroy the American dream and you in the process. But after a short amount of time, the conflict in Europe had subsided. The communist threat was handled, and it was all thanks to the European democracies abandoning their liberal values in the face of destruction from communists. This observation had been noted by the common American man as well, and now they look to you to execute your vision for America, your New Deal, with the force of a dictatorship, temporarily, in order to ensure America's survival of the Great Depression. Even in our history, without the Soviet hordes nearly occupying all of Europe, there was a strong movement in America which had advocated for a temporary dictatorship. Now, with these conditions, the call for dictatorship in America, I predict, would be far higher. But was there ever even the consideration that Roosevelt should become a dictator? In our timeline, even before Roosevelt had been elected, his vice president, John Nance Garner, also known as Cactus Jack, had proposed the idea of a presidential dictatorship to Congress. This Roosevelt dictatorship would allow the president the unilateral authority to suspend congressional appropriations, abolish government departments, dismiss civil servants at his discretion, and reduce statutory appropriations and contractual payments, with Congress only able to check such measures with a 2/3 supermajority in both houses. In our timeline, this was obviously denounced by the Republican leader in Congress, and after enough pushback, the entire idea was scrapped, with the only remaining evidence of such ideas existing in archived Wikipedia articles or several small hearsay documents. It's also worth noting that this idea may not have been embraced by FDR at all. There are some hints that this may have been the case, but I believe that his actions prove that he decided against it for the sake of preserving American democracy. However, I believe in this timeline, given the point of divergence allowing for us a messianic rise of yes man, and the direct threat of socialism destroying the American way of life, Roosevelt would consider the Roosevelt dictatorship option as a genuinely well-intentioned and reasonable response to the terrors of the Great Depression. Therefore, Roosevelt would push the bill forward to Congress, triggering Smedley Butler to act. This would have been occurring while Smedley would have been in contact with McGuire, the business plot's alleged middleman. The idea that if Smedley hadn't acted, a dictator would rise in his nation would spur him to action, collaborating with the business plot, but with his own motives in mind. Now we've caught up with the events of Chapter 37.
Smedley Butler has successfully performed his March on DC
and has become the Secretary of General Affairs, a dictatorial position with even more power than Roosevelt had even considered. But Smedley would convince himself and his supporters that he would only use these powers to prevent a dictatorship. Regardless of the hypocrisy, Smedley would take action to preserve American democracy. According to Smedley's testimony, the Secretary of General Affairs would be a dictatorial position, but democracy would not have been destroyed. The president would still exist, but would only function as a figurehead. The Soga would be able to enact policies, but the policies that he would enact would be presented as if he was an assistant to the president, even if the legal authority was dubious. It's worth noting that the Constitution itself wouldn't even recognize any sort of Soga without a constitutional revision. This position was made out of thin air, and therefore, legally, the position would hold no power. Smedley would actually accept this, as any sort of cementing of this temporary position of the Constitution would go against everything he stood for. Instead, Smedley would only use his powers in a very limited fashion. The first actions he would take would be to kill the dictatorship bill immediately, and reverse the decision to abandon the gold standard in order to appease his benefactors. However, he couldn't do much else. Roosevelt would have won a popular vote not seen in American politics up until this point. Even Smedley voted for him. If he were to enforce an impeachment, citing his consideration of dictator as the cause, he would be going directly against the democratic process in his nation. Instead, the question of impeachment would be left to the Democratic and Republican parties to consider, without his intervention. Due to the hesitancy of Smedley to force any major changes, there would be a small lame duck period, where Roosevelt would remain as president for his term, but would not be allowed to run again. After the next election, the position of Soga would be destroyed, and the democratic process would begin as normal. For the entirety of the 1933 to 1937 term, Roosevelt and Smedley would work together to give the promised New Deal to America, with each ensuring the other was not advancing their own agendas in secret. The backbone of this regime would be the American Legion, a veterans organization loyal to Smedley Butler, which frequently grows as more and more independent organizations fold into the Legion. While Smedley's strength grows, independent from the plotters, they needed to find an alternative pathway to gain their desired governmental revision. Therefore, they would begin attempts to gain more influence in the Senate and Congress. This would manifest into the foundation of the American Liberty League, a bipartisan movement of anti-Roosevelt politicians. Now, in our timeline, it's extremely likely that this coalition was not involved in any sort of nefarious plot. However, according to Smedley Butler's testimony, a member of the plot claimed that an official political movement would form against FDR, and shortly after Smedley claims the statement was made, the American Liberty League was formed. As we're already taking every statement of Smedley as truth in this hypothetical scenario, we will have the ALL be the primary political arm of the plotters. While Smedley may have been acting in his own interests, despite the plotters putting him up to it, the plotters would be able to start nefariously influencing these politicians to encourage a constitutional revision, to entrench the Secretary of General Affairs as a legitimate institution, despite Smedley's wishes. Smedley would begin to notice his posturing against himself. The plotters have started to perceive Smedley as a tool that needs to be discarded before he takes any actions against them. While the most obvious decision would be to simply resign, he could not. There's a legitimate threat that Roosevelt would simply reinstate his dictatorship bill, and Smedley would not wish for that to happen. Instead, Smedley would need to patiently wait for his time to stand down. After the 1936 elections elect a new president besides Roosevelt. However, with the blatant posturing of the plotters, there's a serious potential that one or both parties' candidates for the 1936 elections would be ALL members, and therefore be colluding with the plotters. Smedley is now fighting a subversive battle, a race against time to determine whether or not the actions he's set in motion end in victory for the plotters, or he manages to properly expose these plotters and ensure the democratic process in America. While Smedley and the plotters begin to fight their war in the shadows, a rapidly pro-constitutional and democratic faction will begin to form, the American Restoration Coalition, the ARC. Much like the ALL, this organization would be a bipartisan one, including members of the Republican and Democratic Party who had despised Smedley for his actions against the Republic. However, they would not wish to incite a revolution. Believing that Smedley was truthfully going to step down from his position after the 1936 elections, the ARC would focus heavily on mutually promoting their own Democratic and Republican candidates. These candidates would include progressive Republicans like William Borah, but also the heavily controversial Huey Long, Huey Long was a prominent Democratic Party candidate who was known for his authoritarian leanings, but had an extreme and burning desire to make every man a king. While he was assassinated in our history, in this timeline, he would survive any attempts, being far more prepared after Trotsky's inciting of unrest in the USA. Huey Long would join the ARC in order to advance his political agendas. Since most of his policies were similar to FDR's New Deal, Huey would fill the political vacuum of Democrats who wished to have a strong intervention by the federal government, who now could not vote for the controversial FDR in the next election. Due to this political vacuum, the ARC may determine Huey to be their frontrunner in the 1936 election. However, the Republicans of the ARC would push for a less authoritarian candidate, claiming that Huey would simply act the same way which FDR had hoped to, with more experience given his tendencies. As debate regarding who the ARC would push to become elected raged on, Smedley would begin to covertly support their organization, with hopes that if Smedley fails to defeat the plotters, the more politically experienced ARC would be able to ensure the democratic nature of the USA. This delicate balance of power in America is a scenario I would love to delve more into this hypothetical Season 2 of German October, Semper Fidelis. But that's out of the scope of this video. Instead, we must begin to look at the rest of the world and discover the ramifications of Trotsky's Workers' War in Asia and Europe. While the Stresa Front had remained united against the Bolshevik threat, the controversial decision of Britain and Italy to recognize the North German breakaway state had caused the alliance to fall apart. And now that the major threat, the Soviet Union, has been significantly weakened, the precedent for a second Stresa Front is gone. Instead, each of these nations would begin to pursue their own objectives, attempting to sway each of their former allies to their side. Italy had managed to gain significantly from the Stresa Front. Their new alliance, the Rome Protocols, have expanded to include a significant portion of Europe. Notably, they had included all the nations who were significantly impacted by the post-war treaties and wished to reclaim their territory from those who benefited, whom were in the Little Entente, led by France. Of course, France would not want this Entente to be little. They would do everything in their power to attempt to gain Britain's favor. But due to Britain's own political scenario, they would seek to withdraw from continental affairs and consolidate their empire. Due to the unrest seen at home and in the colonies regarding communist revolutionaries, and the funding of this war against the Soviet Union taking a significant economic toll on the empire, the British had begun to see these foreign entanglements as threats to the empire's continued existence. It's for this reason that our timeline's turtleneck man had proposed a referendum which advocated for corporatist, autarkic principles meant to solidify the empire. The focus on corporatism is clearly fashion-inspired, and it's safe to assume that this would lead to the British Union of Fashionistas to be founded. However, I believe that due to the several divergences from our timeline, this wouldn't happen in the same way. Before Turtleneck Man had founded the Union of Fashionistas, he had attempted to found a splinter party from the Labour Party, known as the New Party. The New Party had adopted his memorandum and had some moderate support. However, it failed to get enough traction, which led to his full adoption of fashion. In this timeline, due to the timing, the rise of National Bolsheviks taking the place of German fashion, and the nature of other British fashionistas, I believe that many would see Mosley's turn away from social democracy towards an isolationist economic recovery focused plan as the true path forward. Therefore, Mosley would become prime minister under his new party rather than adopting fashion. That isn't to say he would be against fashion altogether. He would certainly look favorably upon many fashion groups in Britain, and is far more likely to join the Rome Protocols rather than the Little Entente. However, his program required peace, and a lack of reliance on foreign resources. Thus, Britain under Turtleneck Man would be isolationist. The potential of him losing the election towards a Francophilic leader would change this course. But for now, France was on their own. With Britain falling to a fashion-sympathetic leader and the rise of fashion all across Europe, the natural assumption would be that France would adopt their own form of fashion. However, the frequent antagonism that Italy had put France under would make fashion extremely unpopular in France. Instead, the nationalists who had been swayed to the ideology in our timeline would become more moderate, embracing the Republic's democratic institutions as a means of preserving the French state. This would manifest into an electoral victory for our timeline, at least in this period of history, fashionista François de Larac. The rise of Larac was made far easier than our timeline due to his organization, the Cross of Fire. The Cross of Fire had been favored by French nationalists for their aid in suppressing pro-Soviet insurgencies. However, many would be appalled that these paramilitaries were being celebrated for violence against their own countrymen. They would argue that Laroc's party was no different than Italian fashion at all. In order to alleviate their concerns, Larac would continuously attempt to respect the institutions of the Republic, allowing for France to be strong against their mortal enemy of Germany. France would begin attempting to shift Spain's course away from a full adoption of fashion by supporting the conservative parties that were, as of yet, not illegal in their state, as well as supporting their new German client states. However, one of these states would chafe under the French. It should be no surprise that Bavaria would resent the French for their actions. The Second Treaty of Trier had led to the Bavarian state to lose half of its territory. What would be a surprise is that the man leading the Republic was Ruprecht, the Crown Prince of Bavaria. While Ruprecht was a staunch liberal who had disdain for Mustache Man's beer hall putsch and was the head of House Wittelsbach, the rightful rulers of the Kingdom of Bavaria, he would be the dictator of the Republic of Bavaria. This had actually almost happened in real life, as during the worst phases of the Great Depression, an idea was floated around that the previously democratic government should instead be led by Ruprecht, who had pleased the conservatives and social democrats due to his monarchical heritage and focused on liberal ideals respectively. In our history, Mustache Man had begun to solidify his regime, so this idea was shelved. But in this timeline, it would become the ultimate way for Bavaria to play both sides in the Franco-Italian diplomatic conflict. By being a dictator and flirting with the ideals of Austro-fashion, he could align himself with Italy and prevent their immediate destruction. But they could also play to their liberal aspects and seek to regain their territories and perhaps a leading position in their attempt to destroy the National Bolsheviks. Regardless of the ambitions of Ruprecht, the Bavarians would need to go to war with the North Germans before potentially reuniting their state. While it would be so much easier if they only had to fight the Germans alone, many had feared that the Soviet Union may attempt a détente with their former industrial epicenter. After the Soviet Union had faced their unfortunate peace, surprisingly, the Bedoni government had stepped down, restoring the pre-Trotsky coup chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Rykov, and due to popular demand from the party, Bukharin would be appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Thus, political debates concerning the future of the Soviet Union had begun. As mentioned previously, the ideology of Trotsky being extremely discredited had given the ideology of permanent revolution a blow that it could never recover from. Instead, advocates of socialism in one country would become ascendant. Case in point, the ascension of both Rykov and Bukharin to positions of extreme influence in the USSR. With Rykov and Bukharin as heads of the USSR, the previously shunned policies of pro-peasant agrarian populations would be taken by the weakened USSR, allowing for them to begin to recover from the famine. They would also restore the new economic policy as a means to allow for the Soviet Union to recover. This measure would allow for capitalist structures, with, of course, severe restrictions, to exist in the Soviet Union, but this time indefinitely. But besides the restoration of the NEP, the constitution itself would need to be rewritten. However, due to the lack of a proper unified vision or ideological authority steering the ship of the Soviet Union, the proposed revisions by several party members had led to a major deadlock. What all members of the party could agree upon in this constitutional revision is that the Union itself needed to be more centralized. Due to the nature of the Leninist model of collective leadership, the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars had to appeal to as many republics as possible. This had the adverse effect of fueling Trotsky's expansionism, and simultaneously the alienation of several other communist movements in foreign nations. While well-intentioned, this idea of collective leadership had to be removed in favor of a more centralized model. Among these centralization measures would include the revocation of the Union Republic's right to secede. This policy would be undertaken as a means to ensure the critical security failure of North Germany's secession could not and would not happen again. This measure would also alleviate some of the pressure put on the CPC to accommodate the Union Republic's wishes, further centralizing power. With this announcement of the centralization policies and reversal of the Korean-Siasia policy, the Transcaucasian SFSR had faced serious instability issues. The Transcaucasian nations were all united under an SFSR. After the Stalin Constitution, the borders of the Azerbaijani, Georgian, and Armenian states would be solidified and administered directly from Moscow rather than locally. However, border conflicts and other issues between groups had remained. This caused several insurgencies in the region, restricting the Soviets' capabilities to use the resources of the Caucasus to their full advantage, and occupying the military, which would slow down their ability to begin campaigns of reconquest. It should be no surprise that the Soviet Union wishes to reclaim their territories. Although the extent of the claims varied by different politicians, all agreed that the bare minimum for reconquest would be to annex the Ukrainian state and reunite with the Far Eastern Republic. The Far Eastern Republic itself is an extremely unstable, barely functioning state. Their state only continues to exist thanks to the heavy support from America and Japan, whom both wish to bring into their sphere of influence, but can only manage to enforce their neutrality. While Japan would be more focused on getting their loyalist white movement in charge of the state to reclaim Russia for their alliance, the peace treaty between the Soviet Union and the Asian Alliance, overseen by the Americans and British, had demanded that both the Communist Party and any other white movements to be banned. This stipulation was vital for peace, as if either one of these movements were to become the leaders of the buffer state, a war between the Soviets and the Asians would begin once again. Of course, Japan would be extremely against this arrangement. However, the perceived vulnerability in the presence of Japanese troops in China has led to the doctrine of Hokushinran becoming far more viable of an option. In our history, the Japanese military was split between two different expansion doctrines, the Northern and the Southern doctrines. While the government was initially supportive of the northern expansion route as a means to gain the heavy metals needed for their army, the Navy had eventually won enough influence to convince the government to pursue their southern expansion by gaining the vital resources of rubber and oil for the Navy. In this timeline, due to the ill-prepared, hasty invasion of China and Japan's support, the opinion of the Japanese government would be heavily in favor of continuing expansion northwards. However, a diplomatic event in Asia would shift the direction of Japan. After the defeat of the Soviet Union, the only remaining national claimant to China was Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. Now known by his title of Generalissimo for his victory against the Soviet Union, would proclaim that China was united under his rule. However, this would barely be the truth. Their primary military arm during the conflict of the Soviet Union would be warlords. While they had defended China and recognized Chiang's government, it was only under the condition that they would keep their petty polities. The problem of conditional loyalty from the warlords would be exacerbated by foreign influence. For example, the Buddhists of Tibet would be a satellite state of the British after their support of their regime, and the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement granted Japan special privileges in northern China. Therefore, the Imperial Japanese Army would be entrenched in the regions of Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Manchuria, effectively making these regions and their warlords loyal to Japan. In our timeline, Chiang had always sought to eliminate the communists before eliminating the Japanese threat. However, he was forced into a second united front by his generals. Because the Soviets invaded during the Northern Expedition, the communists had been dealt with, and now Chiang would turn his attention towards Japan. In an attempt to begin centralization and improve the strength of his government, Chiang would demand a renegotiation of the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement. The Japanese would utterly refuse such demands, as the Japanese soldiers had fought to truthfully defend China. To be denied their agreement would be disrespecting the Japanese soldiers who had died defending Chinese sovereignty. This seemingly minor disagreement would soon escalate to a civil war, as the pro-Japanese faction of the Kuomintang, who hadn't been purged due to the point of divergence, had proclaimed their rival government and began collaborating directly with Japan. The northern regions, which already had Japanese troops present, would immediately recognize Wang Jingwei's government, and several warlords who had historically resisted Chiang Kai-shek during the Central Plains War would defect to his government as well. Fearing Japanese ambitions of imperialism in Asia, the British would begin supporting Chiang Kai-shek's government, much like they had in our history. However, with the increased legitimacy of Wang Jingwei's government as compared to our history, as well as the already present Japanese troops in China, the potential for Chiang's government to maintain control is extremely unlikely. During this chaos, The dormant communist cells had claimed control over Shanxi, the very same region Mao Zedong had controlled after the Long March. However, their ideology would be shaped by the events in Germany, therefore taking a far more National Bolshevik position as compared to the previously Trotsky-centric movement. This ideological deviation is proof that the German deviation was being recognized as an ideology independent from Marxism-Leninism, whilst still claiming some form of succession. After the chaos of the Workers' War, Germany was still disunited. The Second Treaty of Trier was not much different than the first, and the largest nation in the region was unable to claim national unity. However, this nation was finally free. German labor would no longer facilitate the elevation of the Russians from their savagery. Instead, German workers would benefit the Germans, and soon their full force would be unleashed. Their armies would unite all Germans under one banner and spread their revolution to the rest of their kin in Europe. The fact that this rhetoric is being espoused at all should make it obvious that Heinrich Laufenberg's decision to unite with the Franconian National Bolsheviks had led to the destruction of the workers' revolution in Germany. Despite his attempts to advocate for his form of National Bolshevism, which is similar to Maoism, he would be continuously defeated in debates against the orthodox Franconian National Bolsheviks. Eventually, the stress would be too much for Heinrich. He would announce that he'd step down once the constitution had been penned and a proper successor to the North German National Council Republic be proclaimed. While officially, the united front of several varying parties would present their candidates, there was clearly only one man who had enough political power to succeed Heinrich: Ernst Niekisch of the Franconian Nazbols. With the ascendance of Niekisch, the state was quickly transformed to be a one-party state, merging the two National Bolshevik parties into one, whilst accepting socialists and nationalists who had demonstrated a loyalty to their ideology. The remaining politicians who refused to fall in line would be soon purged with an event similar to the Night of the Long Knives. Yet, oddly enough, a majority of those whom were purged by Mustache Man in our timeline would become the backbone of the National Bolsheviks, like those under Ernst Röhm, and the Strasser brothers would be integrated into the German National Bolshevik Party, strengthening their party with their influence. But there would be one man who would gain a substantial amount of influence, a doctor who has his roots in political theories, with deep understandings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Rosa Luxemburg, whose oratory and propagandic skills would haunt our living world to this day. I, of course, am talking about Dr. Turkey. In our timeline, Dr. Turkey had not been interested in German fashion under Mustache Man until after he had faced trial for his failed beer hall putsch. Since Mustache Man had died following an anti-fashion coup in Bavaria at around this time, Dr. Turkey would not be able to directly align with fashion. Even if he had heard of Mustache Man's theories, there wasn't much he could do once he was dead. It's possible that Dr. Turkey would even celebrate the conquest of northern Germany by the Soviet Union. However, once Trotsky had taken charge and ran the Soviet Union to the ground through his leadership, he would be more convinced of his anti-Semitic stances. This would all come to a head as the Franconian National Bolshevik Revolution had begun. The admiration that Dr. Turkey would have for Mustache Man in our timeline would instead be directed towards Niekisch, as the orthodox National Bolsheviks would adopt Mustache Man's ideological aspects while still praising the Leninist Bolshevik Revolution. Now this seems incredibly unlikely. Anybody with a basic understanding of history would be right in assuming that a prominent German fashionista, one of Mustache Man's closest allies, would be anti-anything Bolshevik. Yet we have crazy quotes like this coming out of Dr. Turkey after he joined Mustache Man's party. You can argue he was just saying this to get more Germans to vote for their party, and it's completely valid. However, the fact that he was even able to say this, I think, is pretty significant. There's no way in hell I'm repeating it. It's for this reason that I believe Dr. Turkey would become a very prominent member of Niekisch's government, with a high chance of him becoming a future leader of the state. But what would this state's policies be? What is their foreign policy, and how far do their claims go? Well, I can't predict everything, and even if I could, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I think that the easiest way to picture it for yourself is that there generally are timelines fashionable Germany, but this time it's being run by those who have a lot more admiration of socialism and communism than our history. In our timeline, those like Niekisch had desired a greater Germany, with Austria, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, Poznan, and the Sudetenland. However, unlike the German fashionistas of our history, they did not wish to eliminate non-Germans out of their lands through a final solution, rather resolving to assimilate or deport. Rather than annexing all of Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, they believed that the Germans of the East should instead return to the fatherland to help facilitate the demographic shifts that this policy would inevitably cause. The resources available to Germany would be enough to keep a relatively large industry operating. However, many industries in Germany would be heavily inconvenienced by the divorce between themselves and the USSR. While the USSR was not initially industrialized, their access to rare minerals would have provided German industries the ability to develop advanced civilian and military goods. While the USSR was able to benefit from this arrangement, getting them to an industrialization level at around our history's level, now that they were split apart, the Germans would need to trade with the Soviets for their heavy metals. Despite previously hostile relations, Rykov would accept the secession of the North Germans, following the Leninist model of self-determination, in exchange for a mutual defensive pact. The Soviets would trade their heavy metals with Germany in exchange for resources vital to continue their industrialization. This cooling of relations between the Germans and the Soviets had shocked the capitalist world. Despite their incredibly different ideologies, the right communists and the National Bolsheviks would guarantee each other's independence. Many had feared it was only a matter of time before a full alliance was signed, and the Red Terror of the East would crash into Europe once again. What would happen if a second Workers' War were to begin? If it did, how would it? Would France manage to cool relations with Britain or Italy before the inevitable German blitz through their client states? How would the conflict in Asia resolve? Would Chiang's Kuomintang finally unite China without warlords? Or would Wang's desire to modernize with Japan's help only seal China's fate to eternal subjugation? All of these questions could be answered in Project Semper Fidelis. However, whether it would be a video, a nation roleplay, or a Hearts of Iron 4 mod, are up for debate. Regardless of the future of Semper Fidelis, I really hope you enjoyed German October, and please stay tuned for future developments. I would really appreciate any and all feedback that you have for this scenario. I really understand if you're disappointed with the direction. It was going one way for the Soviets and Trotsky, now it's going this way. I promise that I'll go into more detail and actually show the outcomes that you were probably hoping for in a special episode that will come later, but not soon, because I need a break from this project. It's been a really big adventure working on this project. I really want to thank Serov for all of his help. He has consistently been able to be there for me and help explain to me concepts vital to understand Soviet politics and history and National Bolshevism as an ideology. So thank you very much, Serov, for your help. And while they weren't directly involved in German October, I really want to thank my community, especially the community managers, like the unofficial ones, of Solo Leo and Likas. Very great, thank you very much. Of course, all my moderators as well. And my family for inspiring me and supporting me through this huge endeavor. I really appreciate it. And I might have been saying, oh, hey, Semper Fidelis, maybe it's a nation roleplay. You guys should know pattern recognition by now. Stressa had a nation roleplay, Bourbon had a nation roleplay, and now the nation roleplay for German October is live now. Or, well, the server is. I'm not even sure how we're organizing it yet. All I know is that we're going to do it. Since I made the end date of German October 1936 and showed a 1937 conflict, it should be kind of obvious that I'm kind of gunning for this to be a Hearts of Iron 4 mod. So what I'm thinking is that this server can start as a nation roleplay, but then could evolve into a Hearts of Iron 4 mod with inspiration by what people do in the nation roleplay. So if you're interested in that, please join. It would be great to have you. I don't know. We'll see how it goes, but I just wanted to put it out there. Anyway, I've been yapping long enough. You probably already have gone into the Discord and claimed that, I don't know, Germany. Good luck with getting that. But yeah, thank you again, everybody, for your support on this channel. And I'm looking forward to making more videos in the future. If you're an advocate of an ideology of any kind, read the books that the ideologies are based on. And I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye, Lord Boy.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
press a button?
If you press this button, then it'll stop. Press this on the mouse.
No.
Just click here. This one.
This one?
Yeah.